All right, so much of distractions and interruptions today. Oh gosh, why am I looking so black? Where is the lighting? The lighting is fucked up. Where is it? Where is it? Where is the lighting? Should I turn my fucking laptop around? No. Oh god, I look like I'm the big man. Anyway, anyways, let's get back to the work. Okay, so we have learned about this one. It lasted about 4 years, but its extreme measures have lasted after that. In 20th century was a big century. National corporation, so biggest corporations have come up in 20th century after the war, right? And these corporations have been in monopoly, and there is only three choices almost for most of the things, and they are all aiming at the core of the market. They are not distributed for niches. There are no niches. Everything is core of the market, and everybody, millions of people. For example, TV, it has only three channels, and everybody in the neighborhood or whole America with 16 million people in it watch the shows at the same time, at the same day, and at the same show, right? The TV culture was good, and yeah, there was not really much they could watch, and most of it was crap, delusional, and manipulating things happening in the TV. Yeah, that's what it was like practically. And he tried to get out of that using books. He bought a book, and it's actually a magazine, but he has carefully preserved that as a book. And what did he say? It wasn't just as consumers that the big companies made us similar, they did us employers as well. So even employers are treating their employees to be similar, or you know to follow some kind of rules, a little more extreme than others. The models of how to look varied and act varied a little between companies. So they have set a standard for how the employees should look and talk or work, right? And this is gone, thankfully, because now I can wear anything to work and look like anything I want, right? But anyways, let's get back. For most of the 20th century, working class people tried hard to look middle class. You can see it in old photos. The adult aspired to look dangerous in 1950. But the rise of national corporations didn't just compress us culturally, they compressed us. If it compressed us economically too, and on both ends. Along with the giant national corporations, we got giant national labor unions, and in the mid 20th century, the corporations cut deals with the unions where they paid over the market price for labor. Where they paid over market price for labor. Partly because unions were monopolies, partly because as components of oligopolies themselves, the corporations knew they could safely pass the cost on to their customers, because their competitors would have to as well, and partly because in mid-century most of the giant companies were still focused on finding new ways to milk economies of scale. As the startups rightly pay AWS a premium over the cost of running their own servers so that they can focus on growth, many of the big corporations were willing to pay premium for labor. So for labor, they are paying a premium mostly because labor unions are really big. They were monopolies, and since there are no multiple labor unions, there is only one thing, and it has huge power, so they have to do whatever it says, right? If not, entire businesses collapse. As well as pushing incomes up from bottom by overpaying unions, and big companies of 20th century also pushed incomes down at the top by underpaying the top management. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, economic inequality reduces. There are few corporations in which it would be suggested that executive salaries are at maximum. To some extent, this was an illusion. Much of the de facto pay of executives never showed up on the income tax returns because it took the form of perks. The higher rate of income tax, the more pressure there was on the was to pay employees upstream on it. In the UK, there were taxes even higher than the US. Companies would even pay their kids private school tuitions. That is fucking awesome, dude. That is fucking awesome. That is fucking awesome. Private school tuitions? Seriously? One of the most valuable things the big corporations of mid 20th century gave their employees was job security. And this too didn't show up in tax returns or income statistics. So the nature of employment in these organizations tended to yield falsely low numbers about economic inequality. But even accounting after that, the big companies paid their best people less than market price. There were no market. The expectations was that you would work for the same company for decades, if not your whole career. Holy shit. Holy shit. This is crazy. Oh man. Oh man. That's fucking awesome. That's when you actually dream of going into Google or Facebook, right? This is the kind of perks you would need if you want to really, get wet to get into those companies. Really. Not these days, right? No job security, none of these perks, nothing. They don't even care about you. So just quit, man. You don't have to be loyal, and they don't even pay you high. There is no economic equality. It's all fucked up. I don't know why. I feel like that was a great time, and now we are actually living in bad times. This is a harder time to live in, right? Crazy, actually. Oh my fucking gosh. 20th century. It's like my dad's generation, dude. 20th century is my dad's generation. They had good time, I guess. It's crazy to even think about it that way. Your work was so illiquid there was a little chance of getting market price, but the same illiquidity also encouraged you not to seek it. If the company promised to employ you till you retired and give you a pension afterward, you didn't want to extract as much from it this year as you could. You needed to take care of the company so it could take care of you, especially when you would be working in the same group of with the same group of people for decades. If you tried to squeeze the company for more money, you were squeezing the organization that was going to take care of them. Plus, if you didn't put the company first, you wouldn't be promoted. And if you couldn't switch ladders, promotions on this one was only way up. Yeah, there is no promotion parallel, To someone who'd spent several formative years in armed forces, this situation didn't seem as strange as it does to us now. From their point of view, as big company executives, they were high-ranking officers. They got paid a lot more than privates. They got to have expensive lunches at the best restaurants, fly around the company's Gulf streams. It probably didn't occur to most of them to ask if they were being paid market price. The ultimate way to get market price is to work for yourself by starting your own company. That seems obvious to any ambitious person now, but in mid 20th century it was an alien concept. Not because starting one's own company seemed too ambitious, but because it didn't seem ambitious enough. Even as late 1970s, when I grew up, the ambitious plan was to get lots of education at prestigious institutions and join some other prestigious institutions and work one's way up the hierarchy. The prestige was the prestige of institution you belong to. People did start their own businesses, of course, but educated people rarely did. Because in those days, there were practically zero concept of starting what we now call a startup, a business that starts small and grows big. That was much harder to do in 20th century. Starting one's own business meant starting a business that would start small and stay small, which in those days of big corporate companies, often meant scurrying around trying to avoid being trampled by elephants. It was more prestigious to be one of the executive class riding the elephant. By the 1970s, no one stopped to wonder where the big prestigious companies had come from in the first place. It seemed like they'd always been there, like the chemical elements, and indeed there was a double wall between ambitious kids of 20th century and origins of the big companies. Many of the big companies were roll-ups that didn't have clear founders, and when they did, the founders didn't seem like us. Nearly all of them had been uneducated in the sense of not having been to college. They were like what Shakespeare called root mechanicals. College trained one to be a member of professional classes. Its graduates didn't expect to do the sort of grubbly menial work that Andrew Carnegie or Henry Ford started out doing. And in the 20th century, there were more and more college graduates. They increased from 2% of the population in 1900 to 25% in 2000. And in the middle of the century, our two big forces intersect in the form of GI Bill, which sent 2.2 million World War II veterans to college. Few thought of it in these terms, but the result of making college a canonical path for ambitious was a world in which the socially acceptable for work for Henry Ford, but not to be Henry Ford. Okay, so canonical path for the ambitious was a world in which it was socially acceptable to work for actually Henry Ford, but not to be Henry Ford. I remember this world where, well, I came of age just as it was starting to break up. In my childhood, it was still dominant. Not quite so dominant as it had been. We could see from old TV shows and yearbooks and the way adults acted that people in 1950s and 60s had been even more conformist than us. The mid-century model was already starting out to get old, but that was not how we saw it at that time. We would at most have said that one could be a bit more daring in 1975 than 1965, and indeed things hadn't changed much yet. But the change was coming soon, and when the Duplo economy started to disintegrate, that disintegrated in several different ways at once. Vertically integrated companies literally disintegrated because it was more efficient to incumbents faced new competitors as markets went global and technical innovation started to trump economies of scale, turning size from an asset to liability. Smaller companies were increasingly able to survive as formerly narrow channels to consumers broadened. Markets themselves started to change faster as a whole new category of products appeared, and last but not least, the federal government, which had previously smiled upon JP Morgan's world as the natural state of things, began to realize it wasn't the last word after all. When JP Morgan was on the horizontal axis, Henry Ford was to the vertical. He wanted to do everything himself. The giant plant he built at River Rouge between 1917 to 1928 literally took in the iron ore at one and sent cars at the other. 100,000 people worked there. At the time, it seemed the future, but that is now not how car companies operate today. Now, much of the design and manufacturing happens in a long supply chain whose products are whose products the car companies ultimately assemble and sell. The reason car companies operate this way is that it works better. Each company in supply chain focuses on what they know best, and they each have to do it well, or they can be swapped out for another supplier. Why didn't Henry Ford realize the networks of cooperating companies work better than single big company? The reason is that supplier networks take a while to evolve. In 1917, doing everything by himself, he seemed to Ford that the only way to get scale he needed. And the second reason is that if you want to solve a problem using a network of cooperative companies, you have to be able to coordinate their efforts, and you can do that much better with computers, and computers reduce the transaction costs that Coase argued a raise and data of corporations. And this is a fundamental change. In 20th century, big companies were synonymous with efficiency, and the late 20th century they were synonymous with inefficiency. So to some extent, this was because the companies themselves had some scalarity. What the fuck has then scalaritic? So wanting to scale, is that it? Becoming rigid and unresponsive, using the whatever. Okay, but it was also because our standards were higher. It wasn't just within existing industries that change occurred. That is, industries themselves changed. It became possible to make a lots of new things, and sometimes the existing companies weren't the ones who did it best. Microcomputers were a classic example. The market was pioneered by upstarts like Apple. When it got big enough, IBM decided it was worth paying attention to. At the time IBM completely dominated the computer industry. They assumed that all they had to do now that this market was right was to reach out and pick it. Most people at that time would have agreed with them, but what happened next illustrated how much more complicated the world has become. IBM did launch a microcomputer, though quite successful, it did not crush Apple. But even more importantly, IBM itself ended up being supplanted by a supplier coming from software, which didn't even seem to be the same business. IBM's big mistake was to accept a non-exclusive license for DOS. It must have seemed safe move at that time. No other computer manufacturer had ever been able to outsell them. What difference did it make if other manufacturers could offer DOS too? The result of the miscalculation was an explosion of inexpensive PC clones. Microsoft now owned the PC standard, and the customer and the microcomputer business ended up being Apple versus Microsoft. Basically, Apple bumped IBM, and then Microsoft stole its wallet. that's a funny analogy. Like Apple bumped into IBM and Microsoft stole the wallet. The sort of thing did not happen to big companies in mid-century, but it was going to happen increasingly often in this future. Change happened mostly by itself. I love this analogy. I actually want to save it somewhere, right? Okay, where is our master? I'll not write much now. Nothing? Oh. Oh, come on. Say a story. Build in public. Bro, come on. You can't be doing that to me. Aren't you that many people's gonna page? For real. Alright. That sort of thing did not happen to big companies in the mid century, but it was going to happen increasingly often in the future. Change happened mostly by itself in the computer business, and in other industries legal obstacles had to be removed first. Oligopolies, monopolies and oligopolies. Is that it? Monopolies, state of limited competition in which the market is shared by a small number of producers and sellers. It's not a monopoly, it's an oligopoly. It's like limited competition. There is no competition at all. So it's a different thing. Had been anointed by federal government with policies, and in wartime, large orders that kept out competitors. This didn't seem to be dubious to government officials at that time as it sounds to us. They felt a two-party system ensured sufficient competition in politics. It ought to work for businesses too. Gradually, the government realized the anti-competitive policies were doing no more harm than good. And during the Carter administration, it started to remove them. The word used for this process was misleadingly narrow deregulation. What was really happening was Oligopolization. It happened one industry after other. Two of the most visible to consumers were air travel and long distance phone service, which both became dramatically cheaper after deregulation. Deregulation also contributed to the wave of hostile takeovers in the 1980s. In the old days, the only limit on inefficiency of companies, short of actual bankruptcy, was the inefficiency of their competitors. Now companies had to face absolute rather than relative standards. Any public company that didn't generate sufficient returns on its assets risks having its management replaced with one that would. Often, Managers did this by breaking companies up into components that were more valuable separately. Okay, this is crazy. Deregulation also contributed to the wave of hostile takeovers in 1980s. Only limit the only limit on inefficiency of companies and short of actual bankruptcy was inefficiency of their competitors. Now, companies had to face absolute rather than relative standards. Any public company that didn't generate sufficient returns on their assets is having its management replaced with one that would. Often, often the Often the new managers did this by breaking companies up into components that were more valuable separately. Version 1 of the national economy consists of few big blocks whose relationships were negotiated in back rooms by a handful of executives, politicians, regulators, and labor leaders. Version 2 was higher resolution. There were more companies, more different sizes, making more different things, and the relationship changed faster. In this world, there were still plenty of back room negotiations, but most were left to market forces, which further accelerated the fragmentation. That is good. It's a little misleading to talk of the versions when describing a gradual process. Not as misleading as it might seem. There was a lot of change in few decades, and what we ended up with was qualitatively different. The companies in the S&P 500 in 1958 had been there an average of 61 years. By 2012, the number was 18. The breakup of Duplo economy happened simultaneously with the spread of computing power. To what extent were computers in pre-condition? It would take a book to answer that. Obviously, the spread of computing power was a precondition for rise of startups. I suspected, I suspect it was for most of what happened in finance too. But was it a precondition for globalization or LBO wave? I don't know, but I wouldn't discount the possibility. It may be the refragmentation was driven by the computers in a way the Industrial Revolution was driven by steam engines. That is true. Whether or not computers were in precondition, they were certainly accelerated it. They have certainly accelerated it. The new fuel, the new fluidity of companies changed people's relationships with their employers. Why climb a corporate ladder that might be yanked out from under you? Ambitious people started to think of their career less as climbing a single ladder than as a series of jobs that might be different at different companies. More movement or even potential movement between companies introduced more competition in salaries. Plus, as companies became smaller, it became easier to estimate how much an employee contributed to the company's revenue. Both changes drove salaries towards the market price, and since people vary dramatically in productivity, paying market price meant salaries started to diverge. By no coincidence, it was in early 1980s that the term yuppie was coined. The word is not much used now because the phenomenon it describes is so taken for granted. But at the time, it was a label for something novel. Yuppies were young professionals who made a lot of money. To someone in the 20s today, it wouldn't seem worth naming. Why wouldn't professionals make a lot of money? But until 1980s, being underpaid early in your career was a part of what it meant to be a professional. Young professionals were paying their dues, working their way up the ladder, and the rewards would come later. What was novel about yuppies was that they wanted market price for the work they were doing now. The first yuppies did not work for startups. That was still in the future. Nor did they work for big companies, they were professionals working in fields like law, finance, and consulting. But their example rapidly inspired their peers. Once they saw the new BMW 325i, they wanted one too. Underpaying people at the beginning of their careers only works if everyone does it. Once some employer breaks ranks, everyone has to, or they can't get good people. And once started, this process spreads to through the whole economy, because the beginnings of people's careers, they can easily switch not merely employers but in industries. But not all young professionals benefited. You had to produce to get paid a lot. It was no coincidence that the first yuppies worked in fields where it was easy to measure that. Most generally, an idea an idea was returning whose names sounds old fashioned precisely because it was so rare for so long that you could make your fortune. As in the past, there were multiple ways to do it. Some made their fortunes by creating wealth, others made by paying zero-sum games. But once it became possible to make one's fortune, the ambitious had to decide whether or not to. A physicist who's who choose a physicist who chose physics over Wall Street in 1990 was making a sacrifice that a physicist in 1960 didn't have to think about. The idea even the flowed the idea even flowed back into the big corporation companies. CEOs of big companies make more now than they used to. And I think much of the reason is prestige. In 1960, corporate CEOs had immense prestige. They were the winners, the only economic game in town. But if they made as little now as they did then, in real dollar terms, they'd seem like small fry compared to the professional athletes and whiskers making millions from startups and hedge funds. They don't like the idea, so now they try to get as much as they can, which is more than they had been getting. Meanwhile, a similar fragmentation was happening in the other end of the economic scale. As big companies or oligopolies became less secure, they were less able to pass costs on to customers and thus less willing to overpay for labor. And as the Duplo world of few big blocks fragmented into many companies of different sizes, some of them overseas, it became harder for unions to enforce their monopolies. As a result, workers' wages was tended towards the market price, which inevitably, of if unions had been doing their job, tended to be lower. Perhaps dramatically so if automation had decreased the need for some kind of work. And just as the mid century model induced social as well as economic cohesion, its breakup brought social as well as economic fragmentation. People started to dress and act differently. Those who would later call the creative class became more mobile. People who didn't care much for religion felt less pressure to go to church for apprentices' sake, while those who liked it a lot opted to increasingly colorful forms. Some switched from meatloaf to tofu, and others to hot pockets. Some switched from driving Ford sedans to driving small imported cars, and the others to driving SUVs. Kids who went to private schools or wished they did started to dress preppy, and kids who wanted to seem rebellious made conscious effort to look disreputable. And the hundred ways people spread apart. Almost 4 decades later, fragmentation is still increasing. Has it been net good or bad? I don't know. The question may be unanswerable, not entirely bad though. We take for granted the forms of fragmentation we like, the worry only about the ones we don't. But as someone who caught the tail end of the mid-century conformism, I can tell you it was no utopia. My goal here is not to say whether fragmentation has been good or bad, just to explain why it's happening. with the centripetal forces of total war and 20th century oligopoly mostly gone, what will happen next? And more specifically, is it possible to reverse some of the fragmentation we've seen? If it is, it will have to happen piecemeal. You can't reproduce mid-century cohesion the way it was originally produced. It would be insane to go to war just to induce some national unity. And degree to once you understand the degree to which economic history of 20 companies was a low resolution version 1, it's clear you can't reproduce that either. 20th century cohesion was something that happened at least in a sense naturally. The war was due mostly to external forces, and Duplo economy was an evolutionary phase. If you want cohesion now, you'd have to induce it deliberately, and it's not obvious how. I suspect the best we'll be able to do is to address the synonyms of fragmentation. But that may be enough. The form of fragmentation people worry about the most lately is economic inequality. And if you want to eliminate that you are up against a truly formidable headwind that has been in operation since the Stone Age, technology. Technology is a lever. It magnifies work, and the lever not only grows increasingly long, but the rate at which grows is itself increasing, which in turn means the variation in the amount of the wealth people can create has not only been increasing but accelerating. The unusual conditions that prevailed in mid 20th century masked this underlying trend. The ambitious had little choice but to join large corporate organizations that made them march in steps of lots of other people, literally in the case of armed forces. Figuratively, in case of big corporations, even if the big corporations had wanted to pay people proportionate to their value, they couldn't have figured out how. But that constraint has gone now. Ever since it started to erode in 1970s, we've seen that the underlying forces at work again. Not everyone who gets rich now does it by creating wealth. Certainly, but a significant number do. And the Baumol effect means that all peers get dragged along too. And as long as it's been possible to get rich by creating wealth, the defense tendency will be the economic inequality to increase. Even if you eliminate all other ways to get rich, you can mitigate this with people from creating wealth. You're always going to be fighting a losing battle against increasing variation of productivity. The form of fragmentation, like others, is here to stay, rather back to stay. Nothing is forever, but the tendency towards fragmentation should be more forever than most things. Precisely because it's not due to any particular case, it's simply a reversion of the mean. When Rockefeller said individualism was gone, he was right for 100 years. It's back now, and that's likely to be true for longer. I worry if we don't acknowledge this, we are headed for trouble. If we think 20th century cohesion had disappeared because of few policy tweaks, we'd be deluded into thinking we could get it back, minus the bad parts somehow, with a few counter tweaks, and then we'll waste our time trying to eliminate fragmentation when we'd be better off thinking about how to mitigate its consequences. Gosh, so much of. Let's read this. These seem interesting as well. Lesotho White in 1975 said that wage differentiation Wage differentials prevailing the end of World War II had become so embedded that they were regarded as just even after egalitarian pressures of World War II had disappeared. Basically, the same differentials exist to this day, 30 years later. But the golden Margot think market forces in the post-war period has also helped preserve wartime compression of wages, significantly decrease the demand for unskilled workers and oversupply of educated ones. Oddly enough, the American custom of having employers pay their health insurance derives from efforts by businesses to circumvent NWLB wage controls in order to attract workers. As always, the tax rates don't tell the whole story. There were lots of exemptions, especially for individuals, and in World War II, the tax codes were so new that the government had little acquired immunity to tax avoidance. If the rich paid high taxes during the war, it was more because they wanted to than because they had to. That is interesting. If the rich paid more taxes during the war, it was more because they wanted to than because they had to. Okay, that is some interesting fact. After the war, federal tax receipts are, as a percentage of GDP, were about the same as they are now. In fact, for the entire period since the war, tax receipts have stayed up close to 16% of the GDP despite dramatic changes in tax rates. The lowest point occurred when marginal income tax rates were higher, 14% in 1950. Looking at the data, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that tax rates have had little effect on what people actually paid. Though in fact the decade preceding the war had been type of unprecedented federal power in response to the oppression, which is not entirely coincidence because depression was one of the causes of the war. In many ways, the New Deal was sort of a dress rehearsal for measures of federal government took during wartime. The wartime versions were much more drastic and more pervasive, though. The as Anthony Badger wrote, for many Americans, the decisive change in their experiences came not with the New Deal but with World War II. I don't know enough about the origins of the world wars to say, but it's not inconceivable they were connected to the rise of big corporations. If that were the case, 20th century cohesion could have a single cause. More precisely, there was bimodal economy consisting of Galbraith words and a word of technically dynamic, massive capitalized by and highly organized corporations on one hand and hundreds of thousands of small traditional proprietors on the other. Money, prestige, and power were concentrated in the former, and there was near zero crossover. I wonder how much of the decline in families eating together was due to decline in families watching TV together afterwards. I know when it's happened. I know when this happened because it was the season of Dallas premiered. The season Dallas premiered. Everyone else was talking about what was happening in Dallas, and I had no idea what they meant. I didn't realize it till it started doing research for this essay. The metricatiousness of the products I grew up with, as well known as byproduct of oligopoly, when companies can't compete on price, they compete on tile fence. Monroeville Mall was at that time of its completion in 1969 the largest in the country. In the late 1970s, the movie Dawn of the Dead was shot there. Apparently, the mall was not just the location of the movie, but its inspiration. The crowds of shoppers drifting to his huge mall reminded George Romeo of zombies. My first job was scooping ice cream in Baskin Robbins. Labor unions were exempted from antitrust laws by Clayton Antitrust Act in 1940 on the grounds that a person's work is not commodity or article of commons. I wonder if that means service companies are also exempt. Relationships between unions and unionized companies can even be symbiotic because unions will exert political pressure to protect their hosts. According to Michelle Lind, is that Michael or is it Michelle? It's Michael. According to Michael Lind, when politicians tried to attack A&P supermarket chain because it was putting local grocery stores out of business, A&P successfully defended itself by allowing the unionization of its workforce in 1938, thereby gaining organized labor as its constituency. I've seen this phenomenon myself. Hotel reunions were responsible for more of the political pressure against Airbnb than hotel companies. Galbraith was clearly puzzled that corporate executives would work so hard to make money for other people instead of themselves. He devoted much of the new industrial state, to trying to figure this out. His theory was that professionalism had replaced money as a motive. The more modern corporate executives were like good scientists, motivated less by finance rewards than by desires to do good work and thereby earn respect of their peers. There is something in this. Though I think lack of movement between companies combined with self-interest explains a lot of observed behavior. Galbraith says 1952 study of 800 highest paid executives and 300 big corporations found that three-quarters of them had been with the company for more than 20 years. It seems likely that in the first third of 20th century, executive salaries were low, partly because companies then were more dependent on banks who would have disapproved it if executive got too much. This was certainly true in the beginning. The first big company CEOs were JP Morgan's hired hands. Companies didn't start to finance themselves with retained earnings till 1920. Till then, they had to pay out their earnings in dividends and so depended on banks for capital or expansion. Bankers continued to sit on corporate boards till the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933. By mid-century, big companies founded 3 by 4 of their growth from earnings. By the early years of bank independence, reinforced by financial controls of the final World War II, must have been big effect on social conventions about executive salaries. So it may be that the lack of movement between companies was much in the effect lower salaries as the cause. Incidentally, the switch from 1920s to financial growth, which retained earnings, was one of the causes of 1929 crash. Oh my god, how many crashes? So much of crashes. And there is so much of writing work. God. Let's read this one. Alright, Jessica Livingston. It's his wife, okay. Few months ago, an article about Y Combinator said that early on it had been a one-man show. It's sadly common to read that sort of thing. But the problem with the description is not just that it's unfair, it's also misleading. Much of what's most novel about YC is due to Jessica Livingston. If you don't understand her, you don't understand YC. So let me tell you a little about Jessica. YC had four founders. Jessica and I decided one night to start it. The next day, we recruited my friends Robert Morris and Trevor Blackwell. Jessica and I ran YC day to day, and Robert and Trevor read applications and did interviews with us. Jessica and I were already dating when we started YC. At first, we tried to act professional about this, meaning we tried to conceal it. In retrospect, it seems ridiculous, and we soon dropped the pretense. And the fact that Jessica and I were a couple as a big part of what made YC what it was. YC felt like a family. The founders early on were mostly young, and we all had dinner together once a week. Cook for four, cook for the first couple years by me. Our first building had been a private home. The overall atmosphere was shockingly different from a VC's office on Sand Hill Road. In a way, that was that was entirely for the better. That was entirely for the better. There was an authenticity that everyone who walked in could sense, and that didn't just mean that people trusted us. It was just perfect quality to instill in startups. Authenticity is one of the most important things YC looks for in founders, not just because fakers and opportunities are annoying, but because authenticity is one of the main things that separates the most successful startups from the rest. Why YC is an early YC was a family, and Jessica was its mom, and the culture she defined was the one of the YC's most important innovations. Culture is most important in any organization, but YC culture wasn't just how we behaved when we built the product. At YC, the culture was a product. The culture was the product. Jessica was also the mom in another sense. She had the last word. Everything we did as an organization went through her first. Who to fund, what to say to the public, how to deal with other companies, who to hire, everything. Before we had kids, YC was more or less our life. There was no real distinction between working hours and not. We talked about YC all the time, and while there might be some businesses that it would be tedious to let infect our private life, we liked it. We had started YC because it was something we were interested in, and some of the problems we were trying to solve were endlessly difficult. How do you recognize good founders? You could talk about that for years, and we did, and we still do. I'm better at some things than Jessica. She's better at something than me. One of the things she's best at is judging people. She's one of those rare individuals with an extra vision for character. She can see through any kind of faker almost immediately. Her nickname within YC was the social radar, and this special power of hers is critical in making YC what it is. The earlier you pick startups, the more you are picking the founders. Later stage, investors get to try products and look at growth numbers, and the stage where YC invests is often neither the product nor the numbers. Others thought YC had some special insight from the future technology. Mostly we had some sort of insights. Socrates claimed we at least knew we knew nothing. What made YC successful was being able to pick good founders. We thought Airbnb was a bad idea. We founded it because we liked the founders. During interviews, Robert and Trevor and I would pepper the applicants with technical questions. Jessica would mostly watch. One of the applicants probably read her as some kind of secretary, especially early on, because she was the one who would go out and get each new group, and she didn't ask many questions. She was okay with that. It was easier for her to watch people if they didn't notice her. But after the interview, the three of us would turn to Jessica and ask, what does the social radar say? Having the social radar at interviews wasn't just how we picked founders who would be successful. It was just also how we picked founders who were good people. At first, we did this by because we couldn't help it. Imagine what it would feel like to have an X-ray vision for a character. Being around bad people would be intolerable. So we refused to fund founders whose characters we had doubts about, even if we thought they would be successful. Though we initially did this out of self-indulgence, it turned out to be very valuable at YC. We didn't realize it in the beginning, but people who we were picking would become YC alumni network. And once we picked them, unless they did something really egregious, they were going to be part of it for life. Some now think YC's alumni network is most valuable feature. I personally think YC's advice is pretty good too. But the alumni network is certainly among the most valuable features. The level of trust helpfulness is remarkable for the group of such size. Jessica is the main reason why. As we later learn, it's probably cost us little to reject people whose characters we had doubts about, because how good founders are, how well they do, are not orthogonal. If bad founders succeed at all, they tend to sell early. The most successful founders are almost all good. If Jessica was so important to YC, why don't more people realize it? Partly because I'm a writer, and writers always get disproportionate attention. YC's brand was initially by my brand, and our applicants were people who read my essays. But there was another reason. Jessica hates attention. Talking to reporters makes her nervous, and the thought of giving a talk paralyzes her. She was even uncomfortable with our wedding because the bride is always at the center of attention. It's not just because she's shy that she hates attention, but because it throws off social radar. She can't be herself. She can't watch people when everyone is watching you. Another reason attention worries her is that she hates bragging. In anything she does that's publicly visible, her biggest fear, after the obvious fear that it will be bad, is that it will seem ostentatious. She says being too modest is common problem for women. But in her case, it goes beyond that. She has a horror of ostentation, so visceral, it's almost a phobia. She also hates fighting. She can't do it. She just shuts down, and unfortunately there is a good deal of fighting in being public face of an organization. So although Jessica more than anyone made YC unique, the very qualities that enabled her to do it mean she tends to get written out of YC's history. Everyone buys the story of that PG started YC and his wife just kind of helped. Even YC's haters buy it. A couple years ago, when people were attacking us for not funding more female founders than exist, they all treated YC as identical with PG. It would have spoiled the narrative to acknowledge Jessica's central role at YC. Jessica was boiling mad that people were accusing her company of sexism. I've never seen her angrier about anything, but she did not contradict them. Not publicly, in private, there was a great deal of profanity, and she wrote 3 separate essays about the question of female founders, and she could never bring herself to publish any of them. She'd seen a level of vitriol debate and strength engaging. Because she it wasn't just because she disliked fighting. She's so sensitive to character that it repels her even to fight with dishonest people. The idea of misleading, mixing it up with link bait journalists for or Twitter trolls would seem to her not merely frightening but disgusting. But Jessica knew her example as a successful female founder would encourage more women to start companies. So last year she did something YC had never done before and hired a PR firm to get her some interviews. at one of at one of the first, She did. The reporter brushed aside her insights about startups and turned it into a sensationalistic story about how some guy had tried to chat her up as she was waiting outside the bar where they had arranged to meet. Jessica was mortified, partly because the guy had done nothing wrong, but more because the story treated her as a victim, significant only for being woman rather than one of the most knowledgeable investors in the valley. After that, she told the PR firm to stop. You're not going to be hearing it in the press about what Jessica has achieved, so let me tell you what Jessica has achieved. Y Combinator is fundamentally an access of people. Like university, it doesn't make a product, it defines it is the people. What defines it the way is it's the people. Jessica, more than anyone, curated and nurtured the collection of people in the sense of she literally made YC. Jessica knows more about qualities of startup founders than anyone else ever has. Her immense data set, the X-revision of the perfect storm in that respect. The quality of founders are the best predictor of how startup will do. Startups are in turn the most important source of growth in mature economies. The person who knows the most about the most important factor in the growth of mature economies, that is who Jessica Livingston is. Doesn't that sound like someone who should be better known? That was good.